Hey there! This video is going to be a detailed menu walkthrough and setup guide for the Canon R5C. Now, the cinema operating system that's in the R5C is very similar to the one that's found in a lot of other current cinema cameras from Canon, like the C70 and all the other cameras. So if you have one of those cameras, you probably learned some stuff about those as well. So this menu is very deep with a lot of options, but I'll do my best to cover as much as I can. I will go through the settings and let you know how I personally set up and use the camera, but I'll also try to explain as best as possible why you might want to set things up in different ways and how it might be applicable for you. So if you have an R5C or another Canon cinema camera, you can have that out while you're watching this video and follow along and make changes and all that kind of stuff. Now, I also have to say there is a lot of hidden stuff in this camera, and if you really want to get the most out of the R5C, I highly recommend you read the manual. I'll leave a link for the manual in the description down below. Also, I have made several videos about the R5C, and any video that I mention or that is related to stuff that I talk about in this video, I will put a link for those videos in the description down below. I also want to mention that at the time of recording this, I am using firmware 1.0.7.1, which is the most current firmware. So if you're watching this in the future, this is the firmware that I recorded this with in case there are other updates that change the camera. So I'll first just show you some general movement around the menu screen, and then I'll talk about the touch operation at the end because there's some cool stuff on the touch screen, and I do have some cool stuff to share with you, not just in the menu, but in general about the camera. All right, so here we have the R5C, and I reset all the settings. I just changed a couple of them just to make this demonstration go a little bit better. And I just want to mention you can get into the menu in two different ways. You can press the menu here up on the upper left, or this Q button here. There's also a little menu, so you can get into it either way. Now, when you're operating the menu, you can do it in a few different ways. You can just use the joystick here, and if you're up at the top, you can go through all the different folders. And if you want to, within the folder, there's all those subpages. You can press down, and then you can push left and right. You can also go through all the main folders by using the dials. So you can use this dial here, and you can also use the dial up in the front here to do some more coarse navigation through the menus. Okay, so here in the first screen, and let's get started. So first of all, we have the iris mode. So for this, I definitely recommend using manual. I don't think I've ever used automatic exposure on this camera. Of course, this is a cinema camera, so I'd recommend manual. And also you'll get the best settings that way and best images if you're controlling it manually. In terms of the iris increment, you have third of a stop or half a stop. I recommend a third of a stop. I think that's what most of us are used to, but you can do a half a stop if you'd like. For the fine increment, basically if I turn this on, it allows a lot finer control. So if you see the aperture here at f4, if I start moving the aperture, you can see how many times I have to turn it before it even goes up a third of a stop. Now, the number of increments that you get for each stop will vary depending on the lens that you're using. So I'm going to turn this off, but if you want to turn this on, what it'll allow you to do is get much finer control of your exposure, or also you may not see it sort of jump the exposure as much when you are trying to adjust it. It'll be a little bit smoother. Now, the last thing here is the zoom iris correction. And this is grayed out because it says the function is not compatible with this current lens. This is for certain lenses that will let the camera adjust the aperture while zooming to maintain the same brightness. And I don't see it here because my lens is not able to do this. I think this is for some older EF lenses. I've actually never seen this on any lenses I have, but that's what that's there in case you're curious about it. Coming over to the second page here, let's talk about the shutter modes. So it's set to angle, which is what I definitely recommend. I think most of us that are videographers, filmmakers, we prefer to have shutter angle. It's one of the reasons why we like to use a cinema camera. But I want to explain some of the different modes in here because we're going to go through the whole menu. So shutter speed is the thing that most photographers are used to, or if you're using a hybrid mirrorless camera that doesn't have shutter angle. So you have options here for 1/3 of a stop or a quarter stop. I recommend third of a stop. That's kind of what most of us are used to. And if we back out of the menu, you can see we have a shutter 1/50 here. So I can change this, and those look like the normal numbers, 1/60, 1/80, 1/100. Now, if we press the menu and we go back to the shutter mode, let's talk about some of the other options. We will set it to angle, but let's talk about clear scan. What clear scan is good for is it's helpful for dialing in shutter to avoid flickering or banding on screens and stuff like that you can see when you're out shooting. So if we select clear scan, and we look here at the shutter, it's at 49.95. We can really dial this in really fine so we can get this banding or flickering and stuff to stop, or if you just need a very specific shutter speed, you can do that as well. So coming back into the menu here, there's the option for slow. Now, if I select this, you'll see that the slow option allows you to shoot at a shutter that is less than the frame rate. So we're at 23.98 or 24 frames per second, and we can shoot below 1/24. So 1/12, 1/6, 1/3, etc. So if you need to shoot at a shutter speed that's lower than the frame rate, you can do that with that option. So coming back into the shutter mode, we also have off. Off is kind of weird, but I'll just explain what it is. Basically, it locks in the shutter to whatever the frame rate is. So we're at 24 frames per second, it'll lock it to 1/24. So that's another option in there. But what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna go here and set it to angle, because that is definitely what is recommended. For the base ISO, this camera has a dual base ISO, and it depends on what mode you're shooting in. But if you're shooting in C-Log3, the base ISO is going to be 800 and 3200. So what you can do here is you can select either auto selection, which means that if you go to 3200, it will switch over to the second base, or you can lock it into one base or the other. I generally leave this as auto selection, so that if I do raise the ISO, it will automatically switch over. For ISO gain, you can either set it to ISO or gain. I think most of us are comfortable with ISO, so leave it at ISO, but if you want gain, it is an option. And the ISO gain mode, you can do automatic or manual, but like I said before, we're gonna be shooting with manual exposure. And then the ISO gain extended range, there are two different options here. If you leave it to off, it will go up to 25,600. If you turn it to on, the ISO will go up to 102,400. So whatever you want to do, if you're shooting manual anyways, it doesn't matter what you have the setting on. But if you're curious about how to get it above 25,600, you make sure you turn that on. And then the ISO gain increment is 1/3 of a stop or a 1/2 a stop. Like I was saying before, I think most of us are kind of used to 1/3 of a stop increments when it comes to exposure. So leave it at 1/3 of a stop. Onto the third page here. A lot of these settings have to do with auto exposure and auto white balance. So I'm not going to go through these because I think most of us are probably going to be using manual exposure, manual white balance, like I've been saying. So light metering, AE shift, that's auto exposure, shift and response, shockless white balance, auto white balance response. I'm going to leave these all to default because I don't really use them. The last option here is very interesting. This is the color temperature increment, and there's two options. There's mired, I think that's how you pronounce it, and Kelvin. Most of us are familiar with Kelvin, and I think a lot of people don't even know about this setting in here, but let me show you what this is. So if we leave the menu here, let's go into the white balance and go to custom white balance. I'll explain this touchscreen stuff later, like I said. But if we change it here, you can see that it jumps weird increments. So it goes from like 5600 to 5410, right? It's like weird numbers here. And that's because it's set to mired. If we set this to Kelvin, now when we go to change this, it'll change by 100. So I recommend that you use the Kelvin measurement. I think it makes a lot more sense to me, at least. On to the fourth page here is where we start talking about autofocus. Now, I'm going to talk about the settings and what they mean. I could make a whole dedicated video about the autofocus system in this camera, and I might actually do that eventually. But what I want to do in this video is really just talk about what all they mean, and you can go ahead and practice them, and so at least you know what they are. So this is all autofocus stuff. Now, this lens I have on here does have a switch on. So let me turn that off. You'll see that when I turn the autofocus off, all of the options are gone. So this is all autofocus features. So I'm gonna leave the autofocus on so we can access these settings here. Now, continuous autofocus is the first one to talk about. Now, if we set it to disable, this will allow like a single point autofocus. So when you do this, there'll be a box on the screen. You can either touch the screen to move the box, or you can move the box with the joystick here, and then you press the AF on button, which is this button right here, and it will focus on that point. That white box will turn green when it's focused, or it will turn red if it can't focus. And after you release the AF on button, within a few seconds, the box will disappear. So that's a single point autofocus. So if you want to just lock focus on something and you don't want to do it manually, you can do it that way. It is a cool feature. Then you have continuous autofocus only around one focus point. And so what this is, similar to before, you can move the joystick or touch the screen and it will just focus on whatever is in the box, and it does it continuously. So if you want to do that, that's another option. And then you have continuous autofocus enabled, which just allows the camera to continuously run autofocus, and it will look for a subject. So there's lots of different options here. Now for the autofocus frame thickness, you can set this to different amounts of thickness. That's like the actual box. You can set it to normal, slightly thick, or thick. If you need to do that, that is an option here. And the autofocus frame, you can make it large, small, or whole area, depending on what you're trying to do. And The other thing, if you're not using whole area, is for the autofocus frame position, you can actually select it, or you can just have it default to the center if that's what you want. So those are the different options here. Autofocus speed and autofocus response. This is going to depend on, the different lenses and the type of shoot that you're doing. You might want to play with this, but I usually leave them to default as 0. Now the focus mode here is grayed out because this lens has an autofocus switch on it. So if your lens does not, and it is an autofocus lens, some of the more inexpensive lenses may not have a switch on them, then you can turn the autofocus on and off with this setting right here. Okay, on to the 5th page here. This has face detect and tracking, so we can turn the face detect and tracking on. Then you have a few different options here. We have face autofocus, and there's a few options here. We have face priority and face only. This is a really cool feature. One of my favorite things about the autofocus system in the Canon Cinema operating system. Face priority means that if it'll look for a face, if it can't find a face, it'll focus on something else. Face only is really cool because basically it only focuses on a face. So once it locks on the face, if it loses the face for whatever reason, or if the subject leaves the frame, it doesn't jump to something else or like the background or whatever. This is one of the coolest things I find when you're doing talking heads, interviews, all that kind of stuff, is to have face only on. This is a really cool feature. Now you can also turn eye detection off and on. I usually leave that on. And then there's a new, I don't know which firmware this came in, but there's detect from face and face/head. So if you wanted to only look for a face or register a face and a head, you have those options there as well. The camera grip and zoom. This is for lenses that have that feature. I don't have one of those lenses on here. Then you also have the teleconverter, and the teleconverter is a digital zoom. I don't use this, but it is an option in there. If you want to zoom in, I put it in crop mode. There's a Super 35 crop mode and a Super 16 crop mode, but the digital teleconverter is in there as well if you'd like to play with that. That's what that does. On to the 6th page, let's talk about the Auto Black Balance, ABB. This adjusts the black balance automatically. The biggest reason you might want to do this is when the ambient temperature changes a lot. But here are the reasons why Canon says to do this. When using the camera for the very first time, or after a long period of not using it, after a sudden or extreme change in ambient temperature, after changing the sensor mode, going in and out of slow and fast mode, changing the frame rate in slow and fast mode, or after resetting the camera settings. I don't do it all the time, but generally with big temperature swings, or if I'm setting up a camera in my studio or something like that where it's going to be for a while, I will do an auto black balance. But if you want to get the best noise performance and just overall performance of the camera, make sure you auto black balance. And the way you do this is you take off the lens, you put the body cap on, and then you run the auto black balance. It takes like a minute, and just let it do its thing. Make sure the camera's already warmed up before you do that. Going down to the color bars, you can see that this is grayed out, and the reason for that is that I'm in a log profile. So let me get out of log here. I'll show you log stuff in a second, of course. So you can see now the color bars are enabled. And what the color bars do are a couple things. First of all, it puts this image on your screen, and there are a few different options. So there's SMPTE, EBU, or ARIB. I have no idea what those are, but those are the different options there. Not only does it put that on the screen, but it also sends an audio reference signal with a 1 kilohertz tone out over HDMI and the headphone jack. So if you're trying to normalize audio and those sorts of things, you can change the decibels of that reference signal in the audio page 4, but I'll show you that when I get onto the audio stuff a little bit later. So let me turn this off. Going down here to all the lens corrections. So these will only work with certain lenses. And what I'd like to do is turn these on, because a lot of the modern lenses, especially, with Canon RF lenses, is they rely on a lot of these in-camera corrections. So peripheral illumination correction, that will help with vignetting in the corners. Chromatic aberration correction, of course, helps with chromatic aberration. Diffraction correction helps with diffraction with using really high numbered f-stops. And then distortion aberration correction will help change or fix the distortion in the lenses. All these are important. I think they're really good to leave on. Now, chromatic aberration and the diffraction corrections are not applied to RAW recordings, but distortion and peripheral illuminations should work with certain lenses when you're shooting in RAW. Now, the last thing here is the RFS EFS lens correction. Now, some of the more inexpensive crop sensor lenses, like from Canon, they're designed for a 1.6 times crop sensor, and so they may not cover the image circle from those lenses may not cover this camera when you're shooting in Super 35 mode. So if you do that, it will apply a little bit extra of a crop if you're using some of those RFS or EFS lenses. So obviously that's disabled right here, but if you are in that situation and you're getting some really heavy vignetting or portholing going on, you're getting dark areas around the sides, that's where you want to change that. On to the 7th page here. This is all about stabilization. The first option is lens optical image stabilization, and it's telling me to use the switch on the side of the lens, which is true because this lens has a switch for stabilization on the side. If you have a lens that has stabilization that doesn't have the physical switch, you can turn it on and off here. Now this camera does not have IBIS, but it does have digital stabilization, which in my opinion does work pretty well when you pair it with a lens with optical stabilization. So there are lots of different options here. So the digital IS, let's turn this on to show you this. There are a couple different modes. There's standard and high. The standard crops in 1.1 times, so a 10% crop, and the high mode crops in even further. It's a 1.43 times crop, or 43% crop. So I generally leave this on standard, and then I use a lens that has optical stabilization, but play around with it, see what you like. In certain situations, one might be better than the other. If you're not using it in that way, just turn it off. For the lens focal length, this is important if you're using a manual lens that doesn't communicate the focal length to the camera. So if you're using a manual lens, vintage lens, cinema lens that doesn't do that, make sure that you set that in here or the stabilization won't work properly. Now for the anamorphic correction, this is important to set this if you're using anamorphic lenses, and there are a few different options here. Unfortunately, we don't have all of them. We only have 1.3, 1.8, and 2 times. Now, you can also set it to the lens squeeze factor, and this will be based off of what you set in the metadata section, which I can show you a little bit later. But generally, if you're using anamorphic lenses and you want to use the digital stabilization, just set it here. But I just want to let you know that for it to work properly, you have to use set up this setting in here in the stabilization menu. All right, that wraps up the whole first section. Let's get to the custom picture modes here. So we can select a CP or custom picture file here. There are a lot of default ones. Generally, I'm going to set everything to C-Log3. That's how I recommend you shoot this camera. If you need a profile that is not logged, that is colored in, you can use it for a quick turnaround. I use it for live streaming and stuff like that. I recommend that you use Canon 709. That's my favorite. It's one of the newer ones. A lot of people were using BT 709 YDR for a long time, but I do like the Canon 709 if you're looking for a baked-in profile. Now let's go back up to, let's say, C-Log3, and you can actually edit the CP file, the custom picture file. So when you come in here, it says protected, right? So you can't change it. But if you go to unprotect, you can come in here and change this. And there are a lot of different settings in here. One thing I do recommend learning about is the noise reduction settings. And I made a very detailed video about this. And of course, I'll leave that link down below. What I recommend is that you either turn it off, so you have no noise reduction, or if you want to have a little bit of noise reduction, what I found was to set the spatial filter to 4 and the frame correlation to 2. Now, this gave me pretty good results without screwing up the image so much. But again, if you want maximum control, just turn the noise reduction off and then apply it in post. And like I said, I made a very detailed video about that. Now, if we back out of here, let's say that you changed a bunch of settings and you want to change them back. You can always just go to reset. And then when you reset it, make sure you pick the right profile. So I want to use log C3 in the log C3 profile, and I reset it, and now it goes back to protected. So if you want to come in there and screw around with it, don't worry, you can just reset it. Not a big deal. So like I said, I'm either shooting in C-Log3 or Canon 709. And if you're curious about the base ISOs, like I said earlier, if you're shooting in C-Log3, it's 800 and 3200. If you're shooting in BT 709 YDR or the Canon 709 profiles, it's 400 and 1600. And if you're shooting in the BT 709 standard or the BT 709 normal, it's 160 and 640. I do want to mention that the R5C does not shoot in C-Log2. I know there's a lot of misconception about this, but if you shoot in RAW, then you can have your NLE, your editor, interpret the footage as either C-Log2 or C-Log3. Now, I did make a video about C-Log2 not being in this camera and why that is. Of course, I'll leave that video linked down below. I explained a lot of the history of log curves and all that kind of stuff. So This camera can also use custom LUTs. It's the wording is a little bit different, and I did make a video about that too, but I'll give you a quick rundown here. So if we go to the CP file, let's go down here to user, and there's a whole bunch that you can set up, but let's just use the first one here. And if we go in here, we can go to edit CP file like we did before. And this right here is look file setup. This is how you get a LUT in your camera. So if we come in here and we can register a LUT, and here's a LUT from my buddy Tyler Edwards. Make sure that that LUT is loaded in the SD card, not on the CF Express B card. It won't work. So you just put in the root directory and you can load it right here. And then once you load that in, I already had it in there actually. That's weird. Didn't get rid of that when I reset it. And now it's in there. So now when I am using CP9, user 9 here, this will apply the LUT. Now, it will use it as a display LUT. It'll put it over HDMI, all those things, and it will bake it into your footage. So you have to be careful about that. So if you're shooting in XFAVC, MP4, it will bake it in. If you're shooting in RAW, it will not bake it in, but you'll still be able to see it on the screen. So just keep that in mind. If you're using a custom LUT in here, you got to be sure that you want to bake it in. Otherwise, there's no way to just use that as a display LUT and still shoot in a compressed codec. So I just want to make sure you guys understand that. All right, onto the recording media setup. Initialize media. This is where you format your cards. You can format the CF Express or the SD card. I'm not going to do that right now. For the sensor mode, we have a few different options. We have full frame, Super 35, or Super 16. Now I made a whole video about crop factors, again, link down below. Sorry, it's getting old to say that. Full frame in this camera is when you're shooting in DCI, it's actually the full width of the sensor. And when you shoot in UHD or 16:9, it actually crops in by 6.7%. So it's a 1.067 times crop. So keep that in mind. I didn't realize this for the longest time and it was silly of me, but there's a little bit of a crop when you're shooting in UHD. Now, every camera handles DCI versus UHD a little bit differently, but you'll definitely see that here. It's DCI and then it just crops in just a little bit for 16:9. If you're shooting in Super 35, it's 1.38 times in 17:9 or 1.47 in 16:9. And Super 16 mode, it's 2.75 times in 17:9 or 2.93 in 16:9. All right, so let's go back in here and select full frame. And the next thing here is system frequency. This is how you change your region. So if you are in NTSC, so like here in the United States, I'm gonna leave this at 59.94. If you're in a PAL region, like Europe and other places, this is where you change it. So you can see here, if I go down to frame rate, I have options for 24, 30, and 60. Now, if I want to change this to PAL, I change this to 50 Hertz. Takes a second. Has to reboot. Now when we come in here, I have to go back over here. You can see that my options are 25 and 50. So if you're in a PAL region, that's what you have to set this. I'm going to set it back to 59.94 because I'm here in the United States. Next, we'll talk about the main recording formats here. These are all of our different codecs. So if we come in here, we have a lot of different options. So starting at the top, we have RAW ST and RAW LT. Those are two different kinds of RAW. These are 12-bit Cinema RAW Lite files. They come in a CRM file. And also keep in mind that they're going to be in a 17:9 aspect ratio. So if you're shooting in full frame Super 35 or Super 16, it will be 17:9. There is no 16:9 option. Now with these, the ST is going to have a higher bit rate than the LT. If you're going to shoot in RAW, probably just shoot in the LT. The file sizes are absolutely massive on these. And I do have to say that if you do want to shoot in RAW, these files are not only massive, but they're very taxing on your computer. Proxies will need to be made. You have to take precautions and, plan for that and all that kind of stuff. Now there is an HDMI RAW option, and this will send a RAW signal out over HDMI if you want to record on something like an Atomos Ninja V. I don't really recommend that for the most part unless you really want ProRes RAW. This might work with the Blackmagic Video Assist, I'm not sure, but if you want to send a RAW signal out over HDMI, this is where you do it. The next two are the two that I think most people are going to be using and talking about. The XFAVC 422 10-bit is my preferred codec. This is an H.264 file in an MXF wrapper. It also has 24-bit audio. So this one is a lot easier on your computer to edit, and you have a little bit better audio quality than an MP4. Now the MP4, there are three different options, but if you're going to shoot an MP4, please choose the 422 10-bit. That will give you the highest quality. This is an H.265 codec, and this is in an MP4 wrapper, and you only get 16-bit audio. Now, one thing I do want to mention about MP4 is that if you're shooting vertical content and you want your editor to be able to recognize that it was shot in vertical and flip it automatically, it will do that if you're shooting MP4, but not XFAVC. So generally I shoot in XFAVC, but if I am shooting vertical content, I will shoot in the MP4. These are both 10-bit 422 options. There's also a raw HQ mode in a crop mode. So if I back out of here, if I put this in a crop mode, let's put it in Super 35, and I come in here, there's actually a raw HQ mode. That's an even higher bit rate than the raw ST and the raw LT. So those are the different options here. So I'm going to put this back to the XFAVC codec because that's my favorite, and I'm also going to put this back into full frame mode. Scrolling down to the main recording destination, you can either set that to CF Express Type B or SD card, whichever you prefer. I like the CF Express B card because the memory is actually cheaper and faster, so I use CF Express B whenever possible. In terms of the main resolution and bitrate, there are different options in here depending on which codec you're using. So I'm in the XFAVC codec, so I have options here for 4K 16:9, either long op or interframe, or 4K DCI in long op or interframe. For me personally, what I like to do is use the 16:9 long op compression because I'm not doing anything crazy in terms of fast moving stuff very often, and a lot of what I'm doing is going to YouTube. So 16:9 long op is in XFAVC is what I shoot in most of the time. Now I do have to mention that if you are shooting in, let's say, RAW, when you do select that, you don't have any options. Like I said before, you are locked into the 17:9, and RAW is, of course, just going to be that 8.2K. If you do shoot in Super 35, you can see you get that 5.9 or 6K option here. There's no way to change that because you're shooting in RAW. It's pulling the information right off the sensor. So let me set this back to where I had full frame, XFAVC, and we're good to go there. In terms of frame rates, we have options for 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. These are all oversampled from 4K when you're shooting in the compressed codecs. If you want to shoot above 60 frames per second, you have to use SNF mode, which we'll talk about in a second. But what I like to usually shoot in is 24 frames per second. If I do need higher frame rates, I often use SNF mode, but you can also record just directly in those frame rates as well. So let's go on to SNF mode and the different other options in here. So over on the second page here on the recording media setup, we have different recording modes. So if you select this, normal recording is what we're used to, what we've been talking about. We also have slow and fast motion. Basically what happens here is that you can set your frame rate to sample at a higher frame rate, but still record in your base frame rate. So what I would often set this to would be 60 frames per second. So what this does, it will shoot at 60 frames per second, but record at 24. So we'll automatically slow it down to 40% speed or 2.5 times slower. So you can do that in camera, which is really handy because for me, like when I was doing a lot of real estate stuff, I shot everything in 4K 60 and I had it slowed down in camera because it does it a really accurate way in the camera. And I wasn't going to use it at full speed anyways. It saved me time in post. So you can do that. So if you want to change the base frame rate, you just have to come over here and do it. So if you want it to be in 30 frames per second, and then you go over to SNF mode, you could still do 60 frames per second. That would slow it down 2 times. So you have the option to change your base frame rate to get what you want here. The other interesting thing is it's slow and fast mode, so that would be slower. You can also come down here and change the frame rate to 1 frame per second. What this will allow you to do is basically do a time lapse. That would be a slower way to do it. So it'll only capture 1 frame per second, but it'll record it in 24 frames per second, so it'll speed it up 24 times. Hopefully you guys understand what I'm saying. So SNF mode, really cool. Very similar to other cameras like Sony has S&Q mode, so same idea there. Now for the SNF clip / audio wave, this is really neat because when you select this, it's SNF mode like we just talked about, but it will record audio to the SD card. So that's a really cool feature as well. Next we have pre-recording, and pre-recording, if you select this, this allows 3 seconds of audio and video before you actually press record. Keep in mind, this does not work in RAW, but if you're shooting an event, you're shooting wildlife, you're shooting sports, and you have this rolling, you hit record, it will tack on 3 seconds of audio and video before you press record. So a really cool feature. Next, we have frame recording. And frame recording is used for stop motion. I've never actually used this, but basically you can tell it how many frames you want it to record every time you press the record button. So you can either have it record 1, 3, 6, or 9 frames every time you do that. So you just do stop motion, you do your thing, you press the button, you move the stuff, you guys know what I'm talking about with that. So that's frame recording. Then you also have interval recording, and interval recording is a time-lapse feature. So basically you can set the interval between each time it records and then how many frames it records each time. So you can do that as well. So you can either do that here or in SNF mode. I just have options to do both of those. So there's actually another mode which is hidden when you're in XFAVC. You need to be in MP4 mode. This is really cool. I can see a few applications for this. So let me go back here and I'm going to change this to MP4. And when I go under the recording mode, there is this option of 1 main, 2 continuous recording. This is absolutely fascinating to me. And like I said, I think there's a few reasons that you might want to use this. Basically what this does is it continuously records to one of the cards, which would be your number 2 card. So the way we have it set up is CF Express Type B is 1 and SD card is 2. It will continuously record to the second card while you can start and stop recording on the first card. So if there's an event or wildlife or sports and you want it constantly rolling as a backup, which you can go through and pull things out of, but you still want to be able to start and stop it to not like, so you have access to do that, you can do that. It's really interesting. So the way that once you have it set up, there's 2 ways you can do this. Either you can come in here and just turn this to record, and what will happen is the continuous recording will start. And then if we back out of here, you can see it says continuous recording, and then we can start and stop recording like normally to the first card. And to turn this off, we go into the menu and just click to standby. The other way you can do this, if you haven't started yet, if you do go and hit record, it will start the continuous recording and also the recording to the first card. So again, to stop this, go in here and go to standby. So really cool feature, but like I said, I'm going to leave this on normal, and I'm going to go back here and put this to XFAVC. Onto the third page of the recording media setup is having to do with the second card functions. Now, a lot of these options here are grayed out and will become available if the options are something that you can change depending on the different modes that you're in. So clicking on here, we have lots of different options. The first one is going to be 1 main, 2 proxy. This is just as described. We get a low quality and smaller size proxy file to card 2 of what was recorded to card 1. It should have the same name. So if you are looking to get a proxy workflow started and you can just do it in camera, that's a great option for that. So if you select this, you can see you have options for 4208-bit, 4208-bit in XFAVC or MP4. And the other thing here is the proxy record color conversion. You can either apply something different here or just conform to whatever picture profile that you're in here. So like I said, these options will turn on and off depending if you have something to change. Next one down is 1 main, 2 sub. This one is really, really cool. Now, if we come down to the recording format for card 2, you have options of 42210-bit in XFAVC or 428-bit in MP4. What I could see this being really cool for is if you wanted to record RAW to the CF card and XFAVC 42210-bit to the SD card. So I could see this being a case where you have a backup of 2 different styles of recording, or let's say you want to record in XFAVC, but if something was a little bit off, you want a little bit more control, you have the ability to go into the RAW file and use that. Or if you just want a backup of the RAW with XFAVC, you have options. So I think this is one of the coolest feature about the 2-card one. Next, we have 1 main, 2 audio recording. As described, video and audio go to 1. The audio records separately to a separate clip on card 2. Then we have relay recording. And for relay recording, this records to card 1. When that fills up, it records to card 2. You can only do this in modes that will record to both cards. So the SD card might be a little bit more limited to codecs, frame rates, that sort of stuff. You want to make sure you have that. And then double slot recording records the same thing to both. So this is what I would do if I was doing client work and I just wanted to have a redundancy, and the SD card would just be a backup, but I'd be mainly using the CF Express card. So those are the options there. I'm just gonna leave this off for right now. Onto the 4th page of the recording media setup and the metadata. There is so much stuff in here that you can go through and set up ahead of time so that when you get in the computer, you have a lot of metadata to look at. Like I said before, if you want to, we were talking about with the image stabilization, if you want to put the lens squeeze in here, this will put it in the metadata. So whoever's editing it, or if you just don't remember what lens you're using, you can see which squeeze you're using. But again, there's a lot missing in here. But anyways, there's a lot of stuff in here that you can put in for metadata. So that is that's pretty cool. Back out of here. For the record command, this is using the camera's record button to control the recording on an external recorder, connects to HDMI out. You can only use this if the HDMI timecode is turned on. So if we turn this on, then you have the ability to turn this on. And this, as I said, this will, when you press record on the camera, it should trigger recording in your external recorder. I generally don't use this, so I'm just going to leave this stuff turned off. For the MP4 clip and photo numbering, you can either do continuous or reset. Basically, reset will start new numbers when you put a new card in. If you leave it on continuous, it will just continue the numbering, the numbering of the files. So when you pull into your computer, you won't have files that have the same names. I usually just leave this on continuous. For volume label, you can have Canon and then the numbers, or Canon and metadata and the numbers. So for example, right now this will record in, like, it'll say Canon A003 because it will include the index number and the real number. So I usually have that in there, but this is all personal preference. Next, onto audio. You can see that everything is grayed out here, and the reason for that is a lot of these become enabled when you're using an external audio device that's attached to the hot shoe, like the Tascam XLR unit. I made a very detailed video about that one too, if you want to see how that works and all these settings and all that kind of stuff. But page 1 and 2 are all grayed out here. There's nothing to change. On the third page here, you have the monaural mic. That's the internal scratch mic. I usually leave that on unless there's a reason that you need to turn it off, but it's a really good backup. Or if you don't have a microphone attached, it is a microphone, so you want to leave that on. Onto the fourth page here, we have the 1 kilohertz tone. This was when you put the color bars on. This is that tone that comes out over HDMI. In HDMI, you can set it to -20, -18, or -12, or you can turn it off. So I'm just going to turn it off. But if you want to do that, that's where you change that. This is what I was mentioning before. We also have the headphone volume here. The monitor channels, you can have it either do channel 1, channel 2, channel 1, channel 1. This is what you'll hear out over headphones. So depending on what you want to listen to when you're monitoring it, there are a lot of different options here. So you can split left and right so you can see what's going on. This is really handy to be able to customize that. HDMI out channels, you can either send out channel 1 and channel 2 or channel 3 and channel 4. So this is the audio that comes out over HDMI. All right, onto the monitoring setup, page 1. Now, there's a lot of things to customize here. There's only a few things that I recommend. First of which is a lot of people have trouble seeing the screen outside and it's not bright enough, or even inside, whatever. What you want to do is you don't want to change the brightness. You want to change the LCD luminance. That's actually what we think of as the brightness. So I almost always have this set to +2. For every situation, other than maybe if you were in the power saving mode, which I'll talk about in a second, but I'm going to leave it on 0 or normal right now because just for the sake of this video, I want to keep the exposure the same on the camera here. The next thing is the LCD mirror image. What I like to do is turn that on. So that's like if you are turning the camera on in selfie mode, it will flip it so it makes sense. So it only happens when you flip the screen around. So I usually leave it on, but if you don't want that to change, you can leave that off. The last one here is the LCD viewfinder output. And there are different options here. I have it on LCD only because right now I just wanted to leave it on LCD for this demonstration. But you could do auto switching. And what that does is when you put your eye up to the EVF, you can see the sensor will pick that up and change that. So there's a few options in here. There's 2 different options for auto. There's also viewfinder only. You can have the sensor on or off. I'm just going to leave it on LCD for now. I usually do have it on auto though, but if you don't use your EVF at all, just leave it on LCD only. Onto the second page, this has to do with the viewfinder settings. A lot of this is personal preference, so make sure you dial this in how you like. I just usually leave this stuff standard, maybe turn the viewfinder luminance up if I can't see it outside. The last thing here is run viewfinder at 2x speed. I turn this on. What this does is it allows a little bit smoother motion in the viewfinder. It probably uses more battery, but I like the way it looks, so I'm gonna turn that on. Onto the third page here, we have our anamorphic support. So if you want the camera to de-squeeze over LCD, viewfinder, HDMI, you can turn those on or off separately, and you have to just choose which squeeze factor you want. Of course, we have missing ones. We only have 1.3, 1.2, and 2x de-squeezes. And lastly, if you are using SNF mode and you are also looking to de-squeeze in camera, you have to turn this on. Otherwise, you won't see it de-squeeze. It does reduce the display here. It says reduce display, like in terms of making it smaller. But if you're using SNF mode, you make sure you turn that on. Onto the fourth page here, we have black and white options. So this is cool if you just want to monitor in black and white, so you can turn it on and off individually for LCD, viewfinder, and HDMI. But this does not bake it into the footage. You still get a color image. All right, on to the 5th page. The first one here is something that I use a lot, is the OSD output. This is the on-screen display. I think that's what it stands for. And this is over HDMI. So when this is on, this sends out everything that's on the screen over HDMI. So if you're live streaming, you probably want this off. If you are using a monitor, you might want to toggle it on and off. When I'm using this in the studio, often I'll set it up and then I'll just turn it off if I'm live streaming. So I actually set a custom button to this, but you can turn this on and off here. Now, the rest of these settings on here have to do with the display settings when you're operating the camera. So if I back out of the menu here and there's this display button here, see number 3, this will toggle between the different display options. So this is display 1, display 2, and display 3. And you can see they kind of look different, right? This one has a bigger border, and I'll show you that in a second. So let's go into the menu here. Now for display 1, you have options. Display 2, you have options. Display 3, you have options. The apply the peripheral border, that was the border I just showed you. Right now, like you saw, it was only being applied to level display level 2, but you can customize all this however you want. And there are a lot of different options. So like display 1, you can have it all displays, or with the peripheral border, you can see it start to change stuff up here, makes things smaller. So go through and play with this and see what you like. I do want to point out a couple of the custom displays here. So this is custom display 1 and 2. It's just 2 pages of custom displays. A lot of people ask me about where you can find the level. So this is really cool. So there's actually a digital level. If you come in here, there's tilt, roll, and tilt and roll. So let me show you that. So if I put tilt and roll in here, you can see it's got the tilt and roll going on. What I like to do is I turn off the, let's see, which one do I like? I just like the roll. So now this is just a horizontal level. I usually leave that on there because I think it's a really cool feature. A lot of people are wondering where that is in the menu system. It's in the custom display 1. There's other settings in custom display 2. Again, go through here and play with what you like to what you have on the screen. I kind of just leave it as is, other than the level. I do like that one. For display units, you can do feet or meters. I'm in the US, so of course feet. Onto the 7th page here, this is the on-screen display opacity. So this will, the different display here, you can make it darker or lighter to have more or less opacity. So right now it's set to off, meaning it's full brightness. But if, for example, I want to turn the opacity on, you can see how it gets more see-through. So you can change this. Again, this is all sort of personal preference stuff. I just leave it on off. And you can have it do each one individually, or you can apply it to all of the screens at the same time. The next thing here is the on-screen display orientation. And this is really cool because you can actually rotate the display. So if I'm shooting vertical, I will set it this way. And you can see how the screen is now set up to be vertical. So if you are shooting vertical, this is a really cool feature to be able to do that. I actually set this to a custom button, and I recommend that if you are shooting vertical content often. Of course, we need to turn this back so we can finish this demonstration. And for the on-screen display orientation, you can either link it to the LCD viewfinder setting, or you can do it separately if you have a monitor set up in a different way. So a lot of different options in terms of all the display stuff here. On to page 7, this has to do with the tally lights that are on the screens. So either LCD, viewfinder, HDMI, you can mix and match whatever you want here. So let's turn on the LCD for recording. And if I leave here and hit record, it shows up all the way around because that is set to frame. So you could also make it just top. You can see it showing up just the top there, or bottom, just at the bottom there. So personal preference. I know a lot of people like the frame. I kind of don't because it takes up more real estate on this little screen. But again, this is all personal preference stuff. So we can just turn this off, kind of whatever you want to do. Let me stop the recording. All right, moving on to the 8th screen, we have View Assist, and this will apply the basic sort of Rec 709 conversion that's in the camera, and this does not bake it into the image, so this is a great display LUT. This will also put it out over HDMI if you select that. So you can see here, for each one you can customize it for LCD, viewfinder, HDMI, for on and off, and then also the different View Assist here. Unfortunately, you can't use a custom LUT here. That would be a really cool way to do this, but I already talked about that earlier. So generally, I leave this on to get a more colored in look on the screen, but this is all personal preference and over HDMI, unless you are sending out to a monitor and then you have your LUT applied in the monitor, then you can kind of get around it that way. For the View Assist, or let's see, the last one here is an HDR to SDR conversion. So if you are doing some sort of HDR work and you want to lower the decibel of the gain here to be able to see it properly in an SDR, then you have that option there as well on the last thing on page 8. And on page 9, we have range over HDMI. So we can have full range or narrow range, depending on what you're doing. And same thing for HDR. All right, so that wraps up the monitoring setup. Let's go into the assistant functions. Now, a lot of these functions in here, you can operate through the touchscreen, which I'll show you later because that's actually how I prefer to do that. But there's a lot of detailed settings in here that you have to set up initially in the menu system, and I want to show you where they all are. So anyways, the first one is the focus guide. This is a really cool feature that Canon has, and again, this would probably be something I could talk about more in depth in an autofocus guide or video. But if you turn this on, there's a box that'll show up on wherever you can move the box around, or it can go on a subject, and there are these two arrows, and when the arrows, when you manually focus and you lock on focus, they'll line up and it'll turn green when it's in focus. It's a really cool feature. You can also use this in manual focus mode with subject detection, which is really cool. So you can use like a manual focus lens or put your lens in manual focus and it will find the person, and then you can focus on it, and when the arrows line up, that person's in focus. So it's a pretty cool feature. I do use it on occasion. I generally use peaking most of the time, but I have used this too, and it is pretty handy. And then for the focus guide side, of course, there's different options for normal and large. Onto the second page here, we have our peaking. Peaking I use pretty often. What's cool here is that you can actually set up the peaking in 2 different ways. So there's peaking 1 and peaking 2, and then you can see if you want to over LCD, viewfinder, HDMI, like with all the other stuff, you can customize it to, you know, one of them or all of them or any combination. If you come out here under peaking, you can set your color and your gain. I usually like red for most stuff, but it'll depend on what you're shooting. Now the frequency and gain here, you might want to play with depending on different lenses. I've used some, like I was testing out a really wide angle lens. I had to come in here and change this because the peaking wasn't working properly. So it's pretty cool to be able to do that. And I also, like I said, you can access the peaking through the touch menu, but I also usually set up a custom button for this, which I'll do custom buttons and stuff after I'm done with the menu because I use peaking quite a bit. But generally I like I said, I like red. Onto the third page here, we have magnification on and off. So what that'll do is that will zoom in so you can get more critical focus, and we can change the magnification output to LCD, viewfinder, or HDMI. And this is really cool too, is that if you turn this black and white during magnification on, basically when you turn on the magnification to zoom in to get critical focus, actually turn it black and white, which is actually very helpful for judging critical focus. So that's a really cool option. Of course, it doesn't record in black and white, it just helps you when you are doing your focusing. Onto the fourth page, we have false color. Again, LCD, viewfinder, HDMI. You guys see a pattern here. You can turn that on and off. I love false color. I use it all the time. I actually set a custom button to this as well. And if you forget how false color works, there's a false color index here. So if you press this, you can see what's going on here. So for example, 18% middle gray will be green, and clipping, the highlights will be red, and so on. So if you forget what the different colors mean, you don't have to worry, it's in the camera. Onto the fifth page here, we have zebras. I don't personally use zebras in this camera because I have waveforms in false color, but you can set them up and use them however you want. And just like with peaking, there are 2 different zebra levels, and you can customize where you send them to. So you have a lot of different options there, and you can also access this in the touchscreen, which I'll show you later. Onto the 6th screen, we have waveform. Waveform is super important because that's how we're gonna be judging our exposure for most of the time. So I'm gonna turn the waveform on, and when I back out of this, you can see I have the waveform on there, and I can make it bigger and smaller by just touching it. Oh, I left the focus guide on there too. So options here, if you want to see it over the viewfinder, the HDMI, again, you have to set all this stuff up ahead of time, so it's good to go. You also have the option to make this have less opacity, or you can just link it to the on-screen display, which I talked about before. You can change the opacity of all the things on the screen. For the waveform, we can also change it to vector scope, and you can do this in the quick menu too. So we can also use a vector scope, really handy. Leave this back on waveform. There are also settings for the waveform here. Lots of different options. I'm not gonna go through all these, but have fun playing with them. And also for the vector scope, this would be enabled if I actually had vector scope enabled. So you can go through and change the vector scope settings there too. But like I said, I'm gonna put this back to waveform. Onto the 7th page here, we're gonna start looking at the markers, and you can turn them on and off, customized to all the different options here. And then also if you see it over playback. Onto the 8th page here, this is how you actually set up your markers. So if you want a center marker, you have to choose a color and then the different options, cross 1, cross 2. So you can see there's a little cross in the middle there. So again, this is like all personal preference stuff. You can set up however you want. And then there's horizontal markers. So if I put up a horizontal marker, you see a horizontal line, vertical, grid. Well, actually, let me turn these off really quickly. If you want the grid marker on, then you have rule of thirds, and you can turn all of them on and off on the previous page. So again, a lot of options here for markers. Onto the 9th page here, we have aspect markers. You can set it up to be different styles. You can have it with just different lines. You can also mask it, so that'll actually put bars on the screen, and you can mask it at different levels for opacities. So you can come in here and you can change your aspect ratios. So, you know, for example, if you want to shoot 9:16, if you want to shoot vertical content with the camera being horizontal, you can do that here. And if you want to set it to custom, you can come down here, you can set your own custom ratio. So just so many different options here for markers, and you can play around with this to whatever you need. I'd probably, you know, for example, like if you want to shoot CinemaScope without, you can just see what it's going to be ahead of time. So you have a lot of different options for markers. I find the aspect markers to be pretty handy. Onto the 10th page, we have the safe marker area. I've never actually used this for anything, but there are applications for this when this needs to be used. So you can change it to different colors in terms of the borders that it shows there. You can see the white border there, or you can use the masking, like I said before, where it will actually darken what is not in that area. So, and then you can change the marker safe percentage area, and there's different options here. Like I said, I've never actually used this for anything, but some people need this. And then the last page here is you can just go crazy and create any of the user markers that you want in different ways. So you can get really creative with how you do this. There's so much customization. Moving over to the network settings, I'm actually going to skip over this because I don't use any of this stuff, and I probably need to make a whole video about this. So I'm just going to skip over those, but there are options here for networking. Now on to assignable buttons. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do this, obviously, and I'm just going to talk about my personal preferences here and how I set it up. Sometimes when I'm doing different things, I might change some of these buttons, but I'll just show you how I generally set this stuff up. So these are all the buttons on the camera. You can see they're all numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on. 4, 5, 6. You can set these up to basically whatever you want. There are some limitations, but not nearly as much as in the Canon mirrorless cameras. So I'm going to set number 5. That's this button right here. I'm going to set that to false color. All. So now when I hit that button, false color will show up everywhere. LCD screen, viewfinder, HDMI, everywhere. For number 6, I like peaking. All. What else do I have on here? So for tracking, yes, this number 7, I actually set this up to tracking, and this is actually an interesting feature. So I talked about this in a video I did about like 12 features and settings you should check out. So this is cool because generally when you are, again, I need to probably make a whole video about autofocus, but generally when you are using the face priority for face only mode, the subject detection, you can then touch on something and it will turn on tracking, but you can actually set this to tracking separately. So if you're not in, you have autofocus on, but you don't have face detect on, you can just hit this button and then touch whatever you want and it'll track that. So that's why I have a separate button for that. Onto the second page here for number 8, I set this to slow and fast mode so that you can easily go into slow and fast mode without having to dive into the menu. Wherever that is. So you can see there's a lot of stuff in here. Slow and fast motion right there. So that's the one that I like. Number 9, which is usually the key lock button, I changed that to the on-screen display output, which I was talking about before. And that way I can toggle that information, especially like when I'm here in the studio and I'm using this camera for live streaming or something like that. I hate going into the menu and I just going to toggle it on and off pretty quickly. Or if I said like if it's for a monitor. So OSD output HDMI, that's what I like to choose there. And lastly was number 12. This is the button that's underneath. This is the one that I set to change the orientation for shooting vertical video. So if you're not shooting vertical video, don't set a button for this, but it's really handy. There's a lot of stuff in here. Right here. OSD orientation, LCD viewfinder. And like I said, if you toggle that, it'll rotate the screen. So it's really handy if you're doing that. Now, if you can't find a certain feature in there that you want, you can also set up a user option. So let's go to 10 here. If you go down to the bottom, there's user setting. And when you select that, you can actually select anything in the menu. This won't be as seamless as the other ones. This will just open up that part in the menu. But if there's something else that you want that's not in there, you can actually use a user setting. So that's, again, so much customization with this camera. There's also the browser remote settings here. I'm not going to change those. Okay, into the system setup. So first of all is the power source navigation. And most of you probably know that you need certain kinds of power to get into different modes and stuff like that. This is kind of neat. So basically you can check the required power source for something specific. So for example, if I'm using an RF lens and I want to shoot 8K 31 to 60 frames per second, and let's say XFAVC up to 120, hit OK, it will tell you need these different power options. So that's one thing in there. The other thing is you can check the available recording settings based on the power that you have. So if you click on this and you say I have an RF lens and I'm using, let's say, just the battery, it will show you all the modes that you can record in or not record in. If it doesn't have the little circle next to it, you can't do that. So anyways, kind of a cool thing in here that you can, if you forget what you need, you can go in here and either put it in or you can have it checked to however you have it set up. Next, let's talk about power saving mode. And this is actually a really cool feature they implemented in one of the later firmware updates that will give you more battery life in certain modes, but there's some stipulations and limitations. So if I click on this, it will actually tell you what those are. It says you can't shoot in RAW, can't shoot in SNF in XFAVC intra codecs. You can't have the LCD or viewfinder luminance cranked up, which is a big bummer for me because I always like to have that up, like I said before. And then external devices and then accessories. So if you're using like the Tascam unit or something like that, you can't use that when you're in the power saving mode. So we can turn that on. It will help, reduce the power consumption. So you want to use that when you can. Reset here will actually reset all of the settings in the camera. So I'm not going to do that right now, but I did do that before we got started here. You can also save your settings to an SD card and load them. So it's really cool if you're backing it up or if you are putting it in another camera. If you want to copy all the settings, you can do that. Of course, time, date format, and language are all in here to change. It also prompts you to do that when you reinitialize the camera. For HDMI output, you can have it do a few different options. You can either set it to 4K, 1080p, and so on, or you can have it linked to the HDMI monitor. And what will happen there is that the camera will automatically change the HDMI output based on the capabilities of the monitor it is attached to. Because HDMI, the things talk to each other both directions, so it will automatically do that. So different options in here. If you're having an issue where you're not getting a signal, you can come in here and change this. Or if you want to force it to 1080p or 4K, you can do that in here. All right, onto the third page here. We have time code settings. Now this camera does have a time code port, which is really handy, and I've definitely used this on occasion. There's a lot of stuff with time code, and it'd probably be a whole separate dedicated video, but all the time code settings here are on the third page. I'm not gonna go through them in this video. Onto the fourth page, and this has to do with the different dial controls. This is totally personal preference, so I just explain what they are here and you can set up however you want. Right now I have the grip control, that's the one up on the top here on the front that's set to shutter. The top control is this one up here. I have that one set to iris or aperture. And then the select dial right here, I have set that to ISO or gain ISO. Now, this is, I think, the best way if you want to access all these quickly, but I actually don't set it up this way, and let me explain what I do. So the shutter, I actually turn this off, and that's because shutter speed and shutter angle are not a way that I can control exposure. I'm leaving at shutter angle of 180 degrees, and I don't want to bump it by accident, so I just turn that off. The top dial I set to iris because that's what I'm just used to from using Canon cameras in the past. That's always been my iris or aperture control. And the ISO, I actually turn this off most of the time too, and that's because I'm very intentional with my ISO usage. I generally shoot at either the basis, so 800 or 3200. So again, I don't like to bump it. So this is, again, all personal preference. Now, for the different directions, you can have them normal or reverse. So if you're used to something a certain way, you can do that. Just leave them on normal. Now the last one here is the control dial in the menu. So like I said before, if you want to go through the menu system and just by going through the menu, the folders at the top, you can use the dial up here or the dial up here. If you turn this off, or changes to disabled, you can't do that anymore. So I definitely like that enabled. I think it allows me to get through the menu a little bit faster. On to the next page here, we have our control ring settings. So if you have a lens like an RF lens that has a control ring on it, you can either turn that to whatever you want here. A lot of people like this. I leave it off because I wind up bumping it all the time. But if you want to set it to any of those things in here, there are a lot of different options. You have that ability. Control ring direction, of course, you can set to normal and reverse like we could before. Focus ring operation. This you can either have it enabled during autofocus or disabled during autofocus. It depends on what I'm doing. I'm usually an either all manual focus guy or all autofocus guy. So I generally leave this disabled, but if you have it on, there's a couple different modes. You can like have it, you can do some of the focus and then have autofocus kick in and help it and that sort of stuff. So again, depending on what I'm doing, you can turn that on or off. For the focus ring direction, I have that normal. Now this one is really, really important. Varies with rotation speed or linked to rotation degree. Now these are focus by wire lenses, and I found to have a little bit better control of this. Make sure you set this at rotation degree. I don't want it to speed up when I am rotating it. So if you leave this to rotation degree, it will be more linear. It's a linear control for the focus. So make sure you set that. That's a big one. Now the bottom one here for focus and control ring, this has to do with lenses that have a combination focus control ring. Some of the more inexpensive lenses don't have a separate control ring and focus ring. So this gives you that setting in there too if you have those kinds of lenses. Onto the 6th page here, there's some different options for the key lock. Now, I personally don't use the key lock. I actually just showed you that I customized the lock button to something else. But if you're in here, you can turn on key lock at shutdown. So if you do lock the keys and then you shut it off and you turn it back on, then it will keep the keys locked if you have this turned to on. For the key lock, you can have it lock all the keys except for the record button or all of the buttons. You can actually lock the record button here. Now moving down here, you can actually assign button 10 as record. So button 10 is on the top here. It is red. And then we also have button 13, which you can also see is red here. So you can turn those on for recording. I think the one for number 10 is cool, but I generally just use the shutter button. You can also turn this one, like I said, you can set that to record because it is red. So it helps you find that easy. But I use this for the auto white balance, which I'll show you a little bit later. You also have the on-screen record standby button. So if I turn this on and I go to the main screen here, if I see the standby up there, if I hit this, it will trigger recording on and off. Really handy, especially if you don't want to, if you're in a place where you can just do that. Maybe you are recording yourself or the screen's out to the side and you're off to one side of the camera. You can do that without having to go press the button. Maybe it moves the camera a little bit less. So that's an option here. I'm gonna leave that off for now. Touchscreen response, you can set that to normal or low. I've never changed this. Normal works fine for me. Onto the 7th page here, this has to do with our tally lamps. The first one here is the tally lamp, and that one has to do with the one that's on the front. So leaving that on, when I hit record, you will see that it turns red. So that's pretty handy. But if you don't want that and that's distracting for talent, you can turn that off. Now you also have this card access LED on the back. So let me hit record. You can see it turns red. And it's accessing the card. So if I turn this off, now when I hit record, you don't see that turn on. So I definitely leave the one on the back on. I think it's another little tally light to let me know that either I'm recording or it's accessing the card. So I generally leave both these on, but you do have the option to change that. Onto the 8th page is all about the fan in this camera, which is obviously a huge feature in the R5C. It comes default with always on for the fan. So if you just want the fan on all the time, running no matter what, then you can definitely leave it that way. And then you can come down here and change the speed from low, middle to high. Of course, if you have it on high, it will probably use more battery and it will be longer, it'll be louder. If you change this to automatic, which is what I leave it to, you have the options here to, like when you're recording, you can make it lower than when you're not recording. So that would be a good option if you just need it to be less loud. Maybe it's really hot out and you're doing short takes, you can change the fan speed for different options here. Now, one thing here too is that you can see down the bottom here, there is a little fan icon and the green light. So if it starts getting warm, this will change colors. I've never actually had the camera overheat, but there are options there for you to change all of the fan settings. Then you have review recording. Now this is for if you set a custom button to review recording, it will either show you the whole clip or just the last 4 seconds of the clip. So I don't have that set up, but that is what that is. And then there's the GPS auto time, and this you need the GPE2 GPS receiver to use this. I don't have that. Now, one thing I want to mention here is the USB mode. This is how the camera is going to interact when you plug a USB cable into it. So let me unplug the USB cable I'm using to power the camera. There are a few different options. If you choose video output UVC, you can actually use this as a webcam, but it gives you a really low resolution. It's 1088 by 576 or 1024 by 576. It's basically 576p. It's not even 1080p. So I tried using this. It does work. I think you do up to 30 frames per second, but it's not good quality, so I don't like using it that way. You also have the Canon apps for iPhone. This is if you're connecting this to an iPhone the app. I have never actually tried that. And then there's the peer-to-peer GPE2 connection. Again, you need the GPE2 receiver, and you'll connect it over USB if you want to use it that way. I've never actually used these, but I do want to mention something here is that if you do have it to video output UVC and you plug in the power, if you come over here, it actually locks all of the recording modes. So let me unplug the USB. You guys can see that. So I had this issue before. I didn't even realize that was a thing. So make sure that if you're using USB-C power, that when you come in here, that you change the video output to either of the bottom two. Doesn't really matter, but just make sure you have it to one of those two. Otherwise, when you plug in your power, then you can't access those settings. So anyways, on to the 9th one, we have retract lens. So for compatible lenses, this will retract the lens if the lens is able to do that, and make sure the lens is in autofocus mode. I don't have a lens that does that, but that's that option. Shutter shutdown. I love this. This is when you turn off the camera, it will close the shutter to keep dust off the sensor. I absolutely love that. For sensor clean, or you can, if you don't want that, you can leave it open. Some people have preferences about that. I just don't like to get dust on my sensor. For sensor cleaning, you can have it do at power off or at power on and off, or you can turn it off. I like it at power off, so when the camera turns off, it does shake the sensor to try to get any dust off of it. For the hour meter, you can reset the hour meter. I don't recommend doing this, but there is a way, even if you reset this, to actually go into the status menu. I'll show you that later, so you can see actually how many hours are on the camera, but most people don't even know this exists. So if you want to do a quick check on how many hours are on the camera, you can see that here. Or if you want to reset it for a certain project just to keep track, like an odometer in your car or something, you can do that. But generally I just leave this here, and I'll show you if someone has reset this, you can go into the camera and find the actual hours in a different way. Certification information. Yeah. Okay. And the firmware, if you need to update the firmware, put your firmware on the SD card. You can't do it on the CF Express card. It doesn't work. So make sure it's on the SD card, and you just put in the root directory. You come in here and you select which firmware, if you're updating a camera, a lens, an adapter, all those kinds of things. This is where it will find, it'll ungray it, and you can click on it, and it's pretty easy to do. Almost done here, the My Menu page. This is an area, there's actually 5 of these. I don't have anything in here, but if you wanted to customize these, you can come in here and register anything from the menu. So let's say you want to put iris mode in here. Now you have all of the things that you want in here. So you can come in here, you don't have to dive through the menu. If you want to set up your My Menu however you want, you have that option as well. All right, so that wraps up the menu. We've gone through all the settings, and there, as I said, there are a lot in there. There's probably a lot of things you maybe haven't seen before, and a lot of details and a lot of customization, probably more than most of us ever need, which is really cool. Okay, there's a few more things I want to talk about. The first one is going to be the playback mode. So down here, there's the media or play button here. If you press that and you come in here, this is all the clips. Of course, these are all black because I was just toggling it on and off recording while we were doing this. So if you don't see some of your clips, what you can do here is, you see it says XFABC. You can come in here and you can select the different types of clips. So if you don't see your raw clips, you have to hit the raw, MP4, and so on. You go in there and then it'll show you those types of clips. Also, you can switch between card 1 and card 2. I don't have anything on card 2, so you have those different options in here. So this is the playback mode, but I think the first time I ever came in here I was a little bit confused because I couldn't find some of my clips, but you have to toggle between the different record modes up there. Next, I want to talk about the function button. The function button is located next to the shutter button on the top of the camera here. So if you press that, this little orange box will show up on the K for Kelvin or wherever you were last. When you press this, that enables the exposure controls, and when you hit it, it toggles between them. You could go to the aperture and then use like the dial or the joystick up and down. You can also use the joystick left and right to go between them. This is very reminiscent of how I remember this on other Canon cinema cameras like the C200. You could press the function button and then use the joystick to sort of toggle between all that stuff if you want to just access it quickly with your hand. You can definitely do that here too, so it has the same sort of controls. But one thing that's really cool is the touchscreen. So if you look at the touchscreen here, we have this little box in the bottom left that has a screen with a finger. So if we touch that, it enables the touch controls here. And you can go in here and you can just change whatever you want. So if you want to change the white balance, you can do that all with the touchscreen. You can change it to custom A, Sunny, Kelvin, whatever. And if you go over here to aperture, you can go do this and you can just slide this back and forth to whatever aperture that you want. For ISO, you can come in here and you can swipe this back and forth. You can also have preset numbers here. So if you want 800, I'd probably set one up for 3200 as a second base. You can hit register, and then you can register one of them to be something else. So you can go ahead and do all that. So I just registered 3200 there. And for the shutter angle, you can come here and change that as well. You can all do this all by touch. So really handy if you're in a different position, like if you're off to the side of the camera or maybe you're in front of the camera and that sort of stuff. The touch functionality is awesome on this. Now, there's a couple other things in here. On the upper left-hand part of the screen here, you see it has a little settings icon. And for this, you have a bunch of different options. You don't have to dive into the main menu. So if you want to go change to Super 35, you want to change this to S&F, you want to turn the second recording options on and off, the main recording one, you can push to the right, or you can just swipe. So it acts like a cell phone essentially. You can come through and look at and change. You can change your codecs. You can change your resolution, your frame rate. This stuff's grayed out. This is the second card stuff. But anyways, this is in here. You can come in here and change all these settings very easily by just touching the screen. So again, it's right here. You can swipe through them and then back out of it. So really cool. Now, the coolest thing about the touchscreen functionality has to do with the assist functions. I was talking about this earlier. So once you have it enabled over here, there's this little icon down here with a little waveform or whatever is going on right here. Press this and you have all these options. I use this all the time to be able to toggle these things on and off. It's way easier than going in the menu. Really cool. You can turn the focus guide on and off. So that is the box with the arrows that when they get in focus, they turn green, that whole thing. You have peaking. You can do peaking off, peaking 1 setting, peaking 2 setting. You have waveform, so I can turn this off. You see the waveform goes away. I can also turn on the vector scope right here. Remember, if I hit the waveform, it'll make it big. For zebras, I can turn these on and off. I can have zebra 1, zebra 2, or both 1 and 2 on at the same time. I can toggle false color. I can toggle my markers, like whatever markers you had set up. You can toggle that on and off. You can also toggle view assist on and off, all right there. And to get out of this, just hit that button and you're back to the main screen. So the touch screen capabilities are fantastic on here. I use it all the time, especially for those view assists. Now let's talk about custom white balance. So if I come in here to white balance and I set it to custom A, the best way to do this is using a gray card. So you hold up a gray card in front of the camera, we put it wherever the subject is going to be, and then you press this button here, number 13. You can see this has a little white balance symbol, same as that little white balance symbol there. If you can't remember, you hit that, and when it's aimed at a gray card, it'll custom white balance. So I just want to show you guys how to do that, but most of the time I'm just leaving on sunny if I'm shooting outside. All right, so there's one last thing I want to share with you, and that has to do with the status screen, which I was talking about before. Now, it's kind of weird. The only way to access this is to actually set up a custom button. I don't know why they did this, but this has been the case in all the cinema cameras as far as I can remember, and the ones I've tried before. Maybe they just don't want you going in here by accident or whatever. But there's a lot of cool behind the scenes kind of information here. Like I said, the actual hours of the camera, and you can see all the settings and stuff. It's really cool, so I'll make sure I want to share this with you. So let's set up a custom button here. It doesn't really matter which one you choose. I'm going to change it back later because I don't come in here very often. Let's use number 12. And so the one that you're looking for is going to be status. Right here, status. So now when we hit the status button, this screen comes up. You've probably never seen this screen before. There is so much information in here, all the recording settings, everything that's going on inside the camera. Have fun in here, look around. It's really cool. You can see all of your settings for your picture profiles. All that stuff is going on in here that you can see it all in a glance if you want to just see where their settings are at. Like I said, the one main thing I use this for is going to be, this is the audio status one, and if you set that button to audio status, this would show up too. Unlike the C70, there's actually a button for this on the back. This card slot temperature information, such cool stuff here. But what I wanted to point out here was if you're looking for the hours, this is where they are. So if you get a camera, like if you're maybe looking to buy a camera from someone and it's been reset or the number looks lower than you anticipate, you can come in here and see what the actual hours are here. I have not reset it, so you can see that the since reset is the same as the total. Anyways, a lot of other cool stuff in here. Like I said, play around with this. It's kind of cool. But overall, hopefully you guys found value in this video. And if you did, please hit subscribe. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.